chapter in the classical language of teaching. This is considered literature and theory of classical orders or classical architecture. Um, Earlier last month or a few weeks ago, we did several chapters on proportionate geometry. So we're going to be showing writings and text primarily through drawings and diagrams. This one is a little bit different because there is quite a bit of text and information, background information on some of the architects. And Valerie, I think you can see my PowerPoint lecture, right?
So we can see it. It's not in PowerPoint presentation mode yet, though.
Okay, but you can still see the full screen for the images, right?
Right.
Okay, I just want to make sure it's visible and clear.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, so then, I'm going to talk about major texts and masterpieces of classical tradition, really through writings, published books from the 1st century AD up until the Renaissance. Here's a list of the authors and literature. A lot of these authors and literature, of course, they're architects, painters, and writers, primarily through the Renaissance, roughly the beginning of the 1500s to 1570. The first architect is, of course, the first architect, Vitruvius. These are writings and images and pretty much excerpts from each one of the publications. It's kind of a lot of information. We're going to start with Vitruvius, of course. This is in chronological order. The 1st century, we're going to talk about several architects we've talked about before. Cerleo, Alberti, Palladio, Vignola, and some other people we haven't really mentioned before. Again, I am getting a a PDF file of all the PowerPoints I've done over the last several months together. So if you want to take notes, that's fine too, but it will be in a PDF file probably at the end of this week. So what I'm showing you is, before we talk about literature, I want to show a specific building that literally, well, no pun intended, relates to the literature of architecture and writing. I'm sure you've heard or seen this project, the Library of Alexandria, really the ruins of the Library of Alexandria in the ancient world in ancient Egypt. Roughly 300 BC, there weren't really books published or bound like we see today. We have roughly, in this enormous building, here is a reconstruction of the building. It's, in Egypt. It has the Egyptian pylons mixed with the Greek temple front. Here's some other reconstruction. These are the ruins that still exist as an indication of the scale and the location of where this library actually used to exist. And this is just an enormous building, kind of a very complex mixture of Egyptian orders with early classical architecture. And you can see inside of those, let's kind of make sure we have our turned off. Okay, so, we see a mixture of papyrus reeds, an early form of paper, not really bound books. Of course, we didn't have copiers, so if you wanted Okay, am I still muted?
Sorry, Jim, you're all good now. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no, that's fine. Did you hear the lecture earlier?
Sorry, yes, you're all set now. I had just muted everyone, but it muted you as well, so that's my bad.
Okay, that's fine. Well, I was going to show you, the architecture of this is kind of a strange mixture. I'm not sure this is really what it used to look like. These are reconstruction drawings, but a mixture of Egyptian orders and early classical architecture. What you're seeing is not really bound books, but of course, papyrus that is people are writing and drawing notes in. But for the most part, we see this is an indication of what this enormous building used to look like. There's roughly between 40,000 or 400,000 written works. This is a huge complex. This wasn't just one building. It was a large think tank, a place for where scholars meet to read and understand literature, not necessarily about architecture, but what's happening is there's probably a lot of publications that were missing, specifically the formula for recipes, how to make glass, and the formula to make concrete. If you remember from history, is that the ratio of volcanic ash, aggregate, water, and cement was lost during the fall of the ancient Roman Empire. Probably there's some writings about the proper ratio, how to make concrete. Of course, I think you remember from history that how to make glass in the Egyptian cultures. That was considered an accident because the sand accidentally fell on the kiln and melted and made a sort of semi-clear thin layer. But anyway, that's just some interesting speculation about what the writings were in there. Of course, there's theories and probably a lot of poetry. Accidentally destroyed by fire, possibly during the time of Julius Caesar, 48 BC. So the entire thing is lost, but we still have some, recording information of what used to be in that library. Here's the building. So a lot of these writings in this chapter called Authors and Literature, pretty much all these architects are discovering and redrawing the classical orders because, roughly, certainly in Vitruvius' time in the first century A, we didn't have a lot of published information in books. You couldn't go to a library and just check a book out and properly draw a Corinthian or draw a column. But we're going to talk about the theory of the orders. Really all these books we're going to talk about is created for artists, laypersons, carpenters, and builders as a guidebook to follow. These are not to make them famous or popular. These are to kind of educate other builders and architects about a proper columnar order, a proper order of geometry and architecture that was established in ancient Greece and Rome. So pretty much, I'm just going to show you, we'll get into the more specifics later on. But, we look at the charts, we've seen this before, the classical orders, the Doric, Corinthian, Ionic, and Composite. What you're looking at here is a relationship of each architect's interpretation of the orders. We've seen Vitruvius's orders, of course, written about and discussed and drawn in each one of their books they published. Cerleo, we'll talk about Cerleo, Vignola, Palladio. The other ones we're not going to look at yet. We're just going to focus on the first four. We could spend an entire semester on each literature, the writing, the drawing. We're going to focus on really these four: Vitruvius, Cerleo, Vignola, and Palladio. And these people really rewrote the language of classical architecture as a way, a guide for people and artists and painters and builders to follow. Of course, they all have their own ideology. The same thing with classical architects today. Not every architect has the same theory. Of course, if we did, architecture would be very formulaic and redundant. But you can clearly see that, we're still using the language of the proper orders about the height of the columns, the proportion based on the diameter. But Vitruvius, Cerleo, Vignola, Palladio, and others have a specific ratio that they sort of created. So if you look at some of the orders of these charts, there's a lot of information to look at and decipher. It's almost a little bit overwhelming to look at. But first, we're going to look at Vitruvius. This is the first century publication in, probably 100 AD for somebody to write the 10 books. And we're using the word, the books as chapters. They probably didn't have a huge bound publication or probably small little pamphlets that Vitruvius has written. Now, again, this is first century, so probably Leonardo da Vinci and Cerleo, the Renaissance architect, probably took Vitruvius' sketchbooks and notes and made a cohesive, coherent dialogue of drawings and writings. Really, his philosophy, his early philosophy in architecture was utility, strength, and beauty, a triad of relationships. Functional, has to stand up, it has to look pleasing to the eye and beautiful. His first quote was, "The first act of architecture is to break the ground." A lot of my students and my colleagues think that a house or building just sits on top of the ground. Of course, you have to break the ground first for the foundations. Of course, there has to be a second act. The second one is to raise structure vertically to the sky by a later architect, I think in the 17th century, Semper. So Vitruvius, of course, is the first architect, well, one of the first architects. Of course, the first act would be appropriately termed as to break the ground. But his first books are not simply the classical orders, and I don't have a prose or an excerpt for each one of these books because a lot of Vitruvius's writings are somewhat indecipherable. So we had parts of fragments of his writings that some of the architects later compiled as one complete volume. Of course, but he did have 10 chapters. There's a mixture of landscape, but specifically construction materials, proportion architecture, designing if you're designing a temple, if you're designing public spaces. There's a range of a micro scale and macro scale. Finished in colors, really interesting, number 9 sundials and clocks. I don't have images of each one of these chapters, but you can see that the writings are more than just the classical orders. So we look at Vitruvius, we're seeing Leonardo's Da Vinci of his redrawing of the Vitruvian Man based on his notes. This is not Vitruvius's drawing. This is Leonardo's Da Vinci drawn from, of course, Vitruvius's notes in the first century AD. And again, they probably had stone or metal tablets, or I'm sorry, not metal, but stone and clay tablets, some papyrus, but they didn't have a lot of paper back then. So Da Vinci and some other architects pretty much compiled a huge collection of his writings on just some found. It's remarkable that in the first century AD, we still have some of his writings in some sort of tangible form, but this is really not drawn by Vitruvius. This is, of course, drawn by Leonardo. But then, of course, so later Leonardo and some of the architects compiled his books and recreated and redrew his drawings from Vitruvius's notes. So the 10 books or chapters are really more than just buildings. You can see there's landscape, there's, theories about finishes and colors. These are some drawings that were redone from Vitruvius's notes. It's really not that much different from Renaissance 14 or 1500 years later as a dialogue of drawing the proper orders and how they're probably calculated and drawn. And this is an excerpt from probably the first publication, really from Vitruvius's notes. A proper way to design a spiral staircase, a very simple diagram, very, of course, the spiral is very complex, but very mathematically and geometrically composed. And these are some reconstruction drawings, probably redrawn by Da Vinci. Of course, the notes and the prose is probably written either in Latin or Italian. So it wasn't later until American architecture where we have, I'll talk about the American manual, the layer that transcribed these into an English sort of language. But the second most important one is, his name is Sebastian Cerleo. We haven't really seen or heard of a lot of his work. Most part of the class, we're looking at the famous Renaissance architects, Palladio, Michelangelo, and so on. I think in the early sort of list, we have Sebastian Cerleo. Of course, we've seen Alberti, Palladio, we're going to talk about Vignola, then of course Vasari. But let's first start with Sebastian Cerleo. And the reason I'm showing you this first is because this is a chronological list. Pretty much Sebastian Cerleo was the first publication of writings and drawings and a guidebook, 1500 years after Vitruvius published his first series of writings in the first century AD. This is the first publication of the Renaissance of its time. Now we have lithography, we have, easier printing materials than we had in the first century AD. So this book was very widely printed, reprinted, and published. His treatise on architecture, of course, has theories and writings, much like Vitruvius did. Most what I find interesting in Sebastian Cerleo is his kind of redrawings of perspective, which we'll look at in a minute. But he has 7 books, not 10. He condensed and combined and elaborated on Vitruvius's early writings. So we have, of course, which you talked about in the last chapter, geometry, perspective, antiquities, the 5 classical orders, which each architect tries to codify and clarify the relationship, which I'll talk about in a minute. Interesting, number 7, the consideration of common design problems. So I like to show the engraving, because we didn't have photography then, what the actual architect writer looks like. This is the cover illustration, probably drawn by Sebastian Cerleo himself. And these are just some excerpts from the book, some very primitive diagrams of the classical orders, his early studies of perspective drawing. You have to remember, this is Sebastian Cerleo in 1537. Brunelleschi in the 1400s really, introduced perspective, linear perspective, of course, in his baptistry building across from when he was constructing the dome for the Cathedral of Florence. So Sebastian Cerleo is kind of building upon Brunelleschi's inventions in perspective and writing these and providing some simple diagrams of how these things are properly drawn. And these are some of Sebastian Cerleo's exquisite drawings. I mean, the line quality of somebody that can draw like this in the Renaissance is really remarkable. And in the book, he's created his own language of topography, and particularly his perspective engravings, primarily designed for set designs. You know, a lot of these Renaissance architects, they were not just builders, master builders. They wrote, they created plays, they wrote librettos, they drew, they painted. They were just Renaissance in every aspect of the word. This is a very famous classic scene of three ideal set designs. The first one, tragedy, comedy, and satire. It's interesting when you look at the language of these drawings. The tragic one is the most linear one-point perspective. There's a portal at the center of the one-point perspective. The comedy is, you know, it kind of breaks the symmetry and the buildings are asymmetrical, they're kind of regularly placed. Of course, satire is the landscape. This is a very famous engraving and drawing that Sebastian Cerleo, that Palladio later took from this and built a literal perspective theater. But what you're looking at is Sebastian Cerleo's engravings on how Brunelleschi rediscovered linear perspective drawing. These are just wonderful images showing, you know, decay and destruction. These are sort of parodies for, you know, set designs. The famous, you know, Baroque sculptor and architect Bernini kind of wrote plays, sort of making fun of the Pope at the time. But anyway, you can see that Renaissance architects, you know, design more than just buildings. They create set designs. Of course, these are, you know, what I'm considering. These are probably painted on large set panels inside theaters. But again, in his book, you know, he has hundreds of images of just the variation on one door. This is 50 different versions of how to articulate an entryway. So in his, you know, 7 books, like Vitruvius has 10 books, there's different chapters and drawings. And these are still in publication primarily through probably Dover Publications, and I can send you a bibliography. You can get your own copy. I was looking up to have some of the books reprinted as a hard book. Some of them are $700 to $1,000 for each book, because books are becoming rare and valuable now. So bookstores are closing, but these are readily available in paperback. You can find one that's affordable. Anyway, so that's really, Sebastian Cerlio was very influential and somewhat lesser known than Palladio. You know, again, I like to bring the lesser known architects and writers to the forefront because his treatise was probably the first widely published book of its time. And of course, he does have his own canon or way of ordering the classical orders, which we saw in some of the diagrams earlier. And what we've seen is his geometrical language of ordering the parts together, his famous Cerlean arch, which Palladio, of course, borrows. The central panel has the arch. The spring line is flat with the 2 rectilinear side walls. And of course, the circles on either side were the diagonals between the curve and columns of curve. That's a very common motif, which you talked about earlier. This, of course, later borrowed in Renaissance Italian and French architecture. And Sebastian Cerlio was primarily the principal architect of the Renaissance editions, the Fontainebleau in France. So. But let's take a look at what Palladio did in reading about Sebastian Cerleo's work and his language of perspective. Palladio, we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, is that he literally took the images and made a perspective theater. I'm sure you guys have probably seen this in history or early design studios, is that the Theater of Olimpico in Vicenza, where Palladio did most of his work, is that he literally built a perspective theater, is that the streets in Vicenza actually literally converge to one point in the perspective theater. There's a large 3-dimensional proscenium arch that hides the streets behind that. But in the cross section at the bottom right, you can see that the street are these sloping floors and of course the sloping roof. So when sitting the theater, you perceive this as a one-point perspective. Of course, literally, he's building the floors as a sloped section. And of course, the roof is sloped as well too. So these buildings are literally built as a forced perspective theater. Really wonderful to think that somebody can take these set designs and literally build a construction in a perspective realm. We'll look at some more details in a minute. So the next architect I'm sure you've seen or heard about is Leon Batista Alberti. It's interesting to see their faces. You know, when I was a kid studying architecture, I kept asking my mom, you know, why are these people, why are they not smiling? And I was probably 3 years old. My mom said they were serious about the work. And that's exactly their personality. They were very dedicated and very passionate about the work. So here's Leon Batista Alberti, a very kind of mid-century Renaissance architect. Again, he's sort of kind of has his own 10 books. Every architect has 5, 7, 10, it don't really matter the numbers. But again, his pamphlet or publication or manifesto is really the art of buildings. And there's a mixture of materials, construction, the proportion of large public buildings, small houses, the restoration of buildings. This is really roughly between 1453 and 1560, the High Renaissance. So let's look at what about Leon Batista Alberti has written about. Again, he's kind of doing his own take on properly drawing perspective, because it is difficult to manually construct a linear perspective using geometry and mathematics. So some of these diagrams show you can actually properly foreshorten the square grid on the floor. We've seen diagrams like this, but each architect wanted to create their own simple language of how to properly draw these things in perspective. And by this time, linear perspective for artists and architects was a revelation in imagery in three-dimensional. It revolutionized painting, especially three-dimensional painting, versus medieval times where there was no foreshortening and things were out of scale. But so this really revolutionized painting theory, space, and architecture. Here is an excerpt of some of Alberti's own drawings. He's analyzing Gothic cathedrals, and of course his writing is primarily in Italian, which has been later transcribed into English. But these are very dedicated people on how to properly structurally proportion the geometry and the structure of some of these cathedrals. There's a wonderful comprehensive books on all of Alberti's work. This, I think, was published in the 70s, which is probably, hopefully, still floating around architecture schools. This is probably his most complete book, which you can find online. Rizzoli Books are some of the best architecture books. It has pretty much most of the information published in his first publication, the 10 books on his ideology of architecture. Now, again, each architect I'm showing you is still using the classical orders of language that were established, we've seen early in the class, in ancient Greek and Roman societies. And of course, Leon Batista Alberti was a wonderful painter. His image of what's called the ideal city. It almost looks like go back to Cerleo, the tragic scene, where it's really symmetrical on both sides. There's an emphatic one point that vanishes to a portal. So the ideal city in the painting references that as a large urban space with kind of a round temple in the center of the space. So of course, the ideal city is a symmetrical relationship. And this is just a small fraction of his incredible portfolio of work. His, of course, his famous Santa Maria Novella facade in Florence, Italy. Okay, so let's look at the famous Palladian architect. His 4 books were even more famous and prodigious than some of the earlier architects you've seen. The 4 books, of course, are called the Quattro Libri. His 4 books really condenses and comprises some of the early architects into really 4 chapters. Orders of architecture will be seen, the classical orders, residential architecture, public buildings and town planning, and then temples. It's a wonderful engraving of what Palladio looks like at the time. Hold on, my slide is stuck. Very serious. And this is the first frontispiece in the first chapter in the 4 books. So wonderful. I'm not sure if Palladio actually drew these images or not. I think probably some of his apprentices did. But then, of course, he reconstructs some of the early temples. He's probably drawing and creating his own proper canon of proportion with the classical orders, analyzing the Tuscan, Doric, Corinthian, and composite capitals. Well, I'm sorry, not composite, it's in Renaissance. The 3 basic orders as kind of a way of saying this is how classical architecture should properly be proportioned with the orders. His own engraving. And these people went out, these architects went out and measured them themselves and came back and drew them as part of the ideal sort of way of proportioning buildings. Of course, there's a wonderful engraving of one of the first, probably the frontispiece or the front of the book. Then, of course, you can see Palladio's own drawing and analysis of the height of course, the Pantheon. Of course, he borrows these early drawings and studies and incorporates them into his early classic villas. So the book comprises residential architecture, Villa Rotunda, his larger residential projects. You know, the early villas are actually not strictly just palaces, but they are working farms. So you see where the servant quarters are. Parts of the program are more than just the residential bedrooms, but we can see his proper proportioning, what you've seen earlier in the semester about his relationship of the rooms based on his own sort of mathematical relationships. Here's some other engravings. You know, he's showing you how you can properly mix the rusticated base with the composite order, how that properly relates to the arches versus the trabeated system here on the left. His own drawing, one of his basilicas that he studied and built. Then, of course, here's his famous theater of Olympico. I did show some more careful, especially the cross section, you know, really shows that this very whimsical section that he literally built in perspective. So if you think about it, pretty much each architect after this kind of builds and makes and kind of expands on their own right. They're not stealing the information, they're trying to make this as clear and codified as possible. So the next architect writer is probably this extraordinary individual, Giorgio Vasari. I'm sure you've probably seen his work. Let's kind of look at some of his architecture projects first. He did this magnificent Uffizi Quarter, the government offices for the city of Florence. Then, of course, here's the connection from the Uffizi Quarter, then to the PT Palace. It's a private walkway between the urban space, the Palazzo Vecchio, then, of course, onto the Palazzo PT. So Vasari is responsible for really at this time doing a beautiful modern sort of transition between the Arno River and Palazzo Vecchio. These are just here's his project. His main claim to fame in architecture is really his enormous publication on the lives of the great artists and painters. This is a huge set, probably at least 3 or 4 large volumes. What he really did was, aside from building things, he wrote and produced these enormous volume of writings, theories, and techniques of each one of the famous artists at the time during the Renaissance. And let's look at the catalog. This is just a fraction of all the artists in these books. There's hundreds. You know, for some, of course, there's Brunelleschi, you can see Donatello, there's Raphael, there's Romano. This is just part of them. For somebody to single-handedly take on this enormous volume, you know, Giorgio Vasari is doing something a little bit different than the other architects did because his books are primarily a mixture of painters and architects. So he doesn't have his own language of the classical orders. We've already established that, but his collection of writings are just extraordinary. He talks about the technique. There's, of course, Botticelli, the techniques, of course, the theory, and an enormous collection of their ideology. Just a phenomenal book. This is probably why he's called the father of art history. This is really the ultimate book for any sort of historian or artist to really study about all the Renaissance artists. Probably starting from Giotto, the first Renaissance artist, then all the way up until probably Michelangelo before he became a Mannerist architect in the late 1500s. Of course, here's some of his exquisite works. You know, what Vasari did in this plan is he took some of the medieval buildings and absorbed he actually cut out a large urban space to connect from the river to the main space in Piazza della Signora. So he just pretty much built a new facade and kept the existing masonry structure behind that. So it's considered sustainable. He didn't just tear all the buildings out, he kept some of the existing medieval buildings and put a Renaissance facade on top of that. Okay, so after Vasari, we roughly have Vignola. This is a very prominent architect and writer. His books were really 5 books, the 5 orders. Canon of the 5 orders in architecture. Again, we see somebody's an extraordinary individual. These are some excerpts from his books, is that he's still trying to perfect and create his own clear dialogue, how to properly proportion and draw and design the orders. Again, every architect has their own sort of language about how to properly do things. I don't think they're trying to outdo each other. I think they're just trying to make a clear, systematic procedure, building on the architects that created this before. But if you look at the chart earlier that I did, you can see that, get back to this one, that they have their own ideology, their own language about the proper relationship of some of these orders. I think what they did was they took a particular building, classical antiquity, measured it, drew it, and made that the sort of canon as the model to follow for each one of these orders. So let's go back to Vignola for a minute. So here's some of Vignola's architectural project. We haven't looked at Vignola for the moment, but we can see this is incredible pentagon-shaped palazzo there in Italy. The facades have, of course, all these architects are really, mathematicians. They were very emphatic about the proportion of things. If you read Colin Rowe's The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, what Colin Rowe talks about is the numbering and the math on the facades. Primarily the mathematics of the ideal villa, one numerical relationship is the 3, 5, and 7 ratio. The entry gate has 3 bays, and it gradually transitions to 5 bays for the glass facades. Then smaller openings have 7, 3, 5, and 7. Of course, Vignola is probably using golden section proportion and other geometrical relationships. But the facade is not just because he thought 3, 5, and 7 was a pretty number. It does relate to probably ancient geometry and mathematical relationships. But you see, when you start looking at facades and reading about these, there's a specific way and a reason why there are numbers that associate to each one of the openings. Then I think we've probably seen in America the William Ware, the American Vignola. He was considered the American Renaissance architect. Of course, I'm not going to show you his classical orders, but we have a book published with kind of the similar dialogue about the relationship of how to properly draw and calculate the construction of the classical orders. The last one I'll show you is a Renaissance book of gardens. You've probably seen this absolutely beautiful publication. This is called Shepherd Angelico, Italian Gardens of the Renaissance, roughly 1925. So this is, way after, of course, Renaissance architecture. But what they did was they actually had I think it was their thesis project, and the London Association in the 20s. They actually went out to Italy and measured and drew every single really well-known Italian Renaissance garden. They looked at Villa Lante, Villa Madama, Villa Gambaraia, and they took their notes and redid these beautiful reconstruction drawings. Here's an image of probably drawn either by Shepherd or Jellicoe, the frontispiece. And of course, there's some really wonderful, very flowery press, which I'll look at in a minute. But they pretty much did this entire book of nothing but these beautiful watercolor and ink wash renderings of the plans and sections of each pretty much prominent Italian villa. And their notes and drawings are incredible as well too. But they pretty much this is probably the first time that we've seen a collection of all the Italian Renaissance villas in one publication. Here is a reconstruction drawing of Villa Madama. If you remember from history, only Villa Madama in Rome, only half of it was actually built. And so we see in reality is that half of the villa was actually built. They reconstructed what the villa was actually going to look like it was completely finished. And there's some wonderful cross sections of the gardens, how the villa relates to the landscape. I'm just going to kind of read a short excerpt from this. This is we're talking about literature, some very flowery prose, don't laugh at it, but they're associating these two characters, Pandora. I'll just kind of read this to you. Pandora, never lose I'm probably mispronouncing it, a livelier spirit than the one for every parting fancy from design, and those rare moments when the demon sleeps is born a work that stands for all time. So it came into being the finest of the Italian gardens, where in a world of beautiful things, fancy and design roam undivided. Well, that's a very kind of elaborate and flowery prose. It's interesting that I use these characters, fancy and design, as these kind of imaginary characters to kind of guide you through the rest of the book. But fortunately, there is some literal prose you can understand and decipher. But it's nice to see that architects are using poetry and watercolors and drawings as this wonderful dialogue of the language of literature, poetry, and architecture. So the last part of the lecture is these two authors. I've shown you a lot of somewhat conflicting information. I guess I don't mean conflicting, but some very complex architects about their ideology about each one of each person's ideas and theories. But I was going to say, these really two people, Plato and Vignola, really revolutionized and created the most thorough and comprehensive books in architecture, both the four books by Palladio and, of course, the Canon of the Five Orders by Vignola. These are very clear and thorough. The earlier architects we looked at, of course, were revolutionary and pivotal, but really these two books are the clearest and, of course, the most concise in Italian literature. Then, of course, in America with William Ware, he kind of built on these two books and architects and authors and made an English clarity of language and visual dialogue and how to properly scale and proportion the classical orders, of course, starting from Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and composite orders. Okay, so that actually ends the lecture. I'm happy to go back and stop on some of the slides. I'm sure you guys have questions. So I think, Valerie, you can tell me what questions are in the chat box.
Don't have any so far, but once they come in, I will be sure to relay those to you.
And this isn't Valerie, this is a different
Sorry,
one.
yeah, this is Lindsay.
Lindsay, okay, sorry.
Sorry, we switched.
Yeah, I went over a lot of information. The good thing is about in looking at all these, you can reference and buy each one of these books online for your own reference. But the easiest ones to understand are probably Palladian and Vignola. And Lindsay, how many students do we have in classes?
We have 17 participants. Lauren says, enjoyed this lecture very much. So interesting to see the comparisons.
Okay. Yeah, this is a lot of information, a lot of architects. It's kind of mind-boggling with all the different research that was compiled into doing this. But I try to make the lectures easy to understand, kind of identify, because there is tons of, I know it's overwhelming for a novice at this to kind of look at, especially all these charts for, where do you start if I wanted to design a Corinthian column? I mean, which book do I look at? Since we're in America now, the easiest one to read and understand and apply is, of course, the American Vignola.
She says, no computers, just paper, totally amazing.
Oh, I know, yeah.
Definitely.
Oh, yeah, especially for somebody to go out to the field. This is probably measured from an enormous temple, the Temple of Luxor, which is enormous. For somebody to measure that by hand, draw it by hand, print it, have it engraved in, because you couldn't just, go buy a copy at a bookstore, especially if you were just looking at drawings in the Library of Alexandria, is that you couldn't just get a copy. Let me scroll up to this one. You would have scholars, people that worked in this, they would redraw them for you and rewrite these. So they didn't have copiers. Somebody would manually redraw a literature of prose or a drawing. This must have been an absolutely wonderful space to be in at the time period, 300 BC. I find it hard to believe that there's Egyptian pylons with the Greek temple. Maybe it really existed like that.
I'm not seeing any pressing questions right now, but if anyone else has anything to comment or questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Or if you prefer to unmute yourself, I'm happy to do that as well.
I guess, well, when somebody, mentions a question, what I find really exciting is the language of drawing perspective, because before this, there really weren't publications on how to properly draw foreshortening at all. It was only until the 1700s that we removed all the volcanic ash from the ruins in Pompeii and figured out that they had already created linear perspective before this. But this is really unheard of at the time. You can imagine especially let's take a look at the linear perspective that Cerlio had created, and then what Alberti did as a painting. Before the Renaissance, we didn't have proper foreshortening. It would be very sort of crude. They didn't have atmospheric perspective, so you would not see the parallel lines vanishing to a point in medieval times or in medieval paintings. It's also interesting to see that I've never seen one perspective drawing that Palladian had probably drawn, or Vignola, probably because perspective drawings are not analytical. Perspective drawings are distorted images of reality. Somebody asked me that, but for the most part, they are drawing sections, element, because you really can't analyze perspective drawings or buildings on an oblique. Because if you look at this, you can't, analyze the proportions in an oblique building like that. So. But by this time, how could you not understand linear perspective when you're designing? This is designed as a one-point perspective view. Phenomenal. Of course, he's factoring in linear perspective in the linear condition of this urban piazza, which is just wonderful to even walk through.
There's one question here. It's, what was the name of the book resource again? Was it Rizzoli?
That's what, yes, Rizzoli. I think Rizzoli has probably some of the best architecture books, because the Rizzoli, let me go back to the image. Yeah, I think this one's written by Francisco Borsi. Of course, he's Italian. Because Rizzoli books are more analytical. A lot of the Phaidon books are great, but they have a lot of what I'm calling coffee table picturesque images. But if you want to study architecture, well, the Rizzoli books are very good as well too.
We have a comment from Hill. He says, I find the American Vignola the most useful and accessible, and the parallel of classical orders of architecture published by ICAA as the most interesting as a source.
Oh, good.
Sorry for the dog in the background here.
No, I figured the dog had probably read the book. No, no, you're right. Because I used to work for Ralph Dusing Architect for 10 years, and he had an extraordinary library. And every time I had to design, a proper Tuscan or Doric column, the first book that I would go to is American Vignola. It's easier to understand. And I think American Vignola is written in feet and inches, not centimeters. Because if you look at Palladio's 4 books, they're written in what's called Italian braccia. And it's really, really hard to, you have to convert all the dimensions to the metric system or centimeters or, the metric scale. So it's really hard to measure anything from Italian literature. That's kind of why when you look at the American Vignola, it's written in feet and inches and you can read it in English. Because you kind of have to factor the fact that if you take a Latin or Italian piece of prose, there are some liberties in properly translating the language. That's why the American Vignola is easy for, people in America to kind of understand and measure and draw things. So, yeah. But what I'm saying at the end of the lecture is, at the time period in architecture and Renaissance, is that Palladio and Vignola were the ones that clearly transferred pretty much all the philosophy from the 1st century AD up until Palladio and Vignola. Because for the fact that Palladio could condense everything into 4 books versus 10 is, a masterpiece.
Those are some great additions. I think you've just blown everyone away. There's no questions.
Oh my gosh. Well, if there's not no question, I was going to say we have about 15 more minutes. This is the first lecture on 4 other chapters. I'm obsessed with books and chapters. Books in literature are chapters. So this chapter is literature and theory of classical architecture. Today is master texts and masterpieces of the classical tradition. The next week is fundamental design principles. This 27th is paradigmatic buildings, and of course, last one's contemporary built environment. There was one piece of literature that I was hesitant about showing. Can you guys see my drawing table for a minute? You can see the front page of Complexity and Contradiction by Venturi. Can you guys see that?
Yes, it's in your
My
speaker
drawing.
screen.
Yeah. I hesitated about showing this because I thought it was, it's technically a postmodern, not a classical piece of literature, but obviously Venturi does reference, the Porta by Michelangelo is on the cover. I didn't include this. I kind of wish I would have because it's only 50 more minutes. But what happens is he does I'll kind of open this book, but Complexity is kind of what I'm calling a reduced version of a comparative discussion between the language of the perplexities of some of the early classical architects. We have Lutyens, we have Michelangelo's bizarre language. Let me see if I can turn it if you guys want to watch this. I should have included this in my lecture. I'm sorry, but there are some really interesting dialogues about, well, for instance, this is Nicholas Hawksmoor's work. If you look at Nicholas Hawksmoor as a London classical architect, what he's talking about is the strange visual relationship of, is it a wall building or is it a tower? It's a complex relationship because normally towers and architecture are very thin, but you can see is that Venturi discusses the complexity and visual paradox about, is this building a wall or is it a tower? It's really hard to decipher. It's maybe both and. He talks about the duality of both and conditions, especially when we get to Lutyens' work. Let me see if I can find that staircase. And I hope I'm not losing your attention because I don't have this book properly memorized. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, let's take a look at this wonderful staircase by Lutyens. The duality which Venturi talks about, this is kind of a minor detail, but really important, is that the first layer of the stairs, it's not just the staircase, but the staircase is aligned with the wainscot of the large arch. Then, of course, the main staircase breaks and the rise and run are in its own room. So there's a language of the landing aligns with the base or the wainscot. You can consider this arch as a large columnar base. The same thing talks about the language of the gate height versus the roof on gray walls by Lutyens. And also, that's just a minor detail, but he does discuss, this is written in postmodern 1966, about his famous quote is, less is a bore. So when you look at these projects, they're visibly very complicated and somewhat very difficult to, especially Baroque architecture, to visually understand and sort of analyze these things. He talks about a language of Palladian relationships, a lot of paradoxes, but it's really good to kind of break away from, I guess, the kind of literature, the literal language of the classical orders and see someone imaginative as this to combine postmodern architecture as a way of referencing classical. Because if you look at Venturi's postmodern architecture, his work is mostly puns on classical architecture. He and his wife partner, well, people refer to them as Denise Scott Brown and Venturi as these sort of, they're making literal jokes and puns on classical architecture. But this is a very serious publication. It's not controversial. It's just, definitely not for a beginning reader. But anyway. But architecture, what's interesting, I think, is architecture is full of contradictions and complexity. Of course it is. And honestly, if you're an art historian, I would just maybe spend a whole summer and read all these books that Giorgio Vasari spent years. Right, he was a very benevolent individual. He was primarily based in Florence, and a lot of his criticism is the fact that he focused only on Florentine architects. But once you have Michelangelo, and I mean, that is the place for Renaissance architecture. But however, he actually walked through and gave lectures in Florence about celebrating all these artists and architects. He wasn't this very self-involved individual. He pretty much introduced and brought to the forefront all these really wonderful painters that you really haven't seen or heard of. And some of these, I'm just saying, this is probably the first 3 books. There's 7. and there's probably 300 painters. It's almost like, you know, a literal, well, not literal, but a literature published on writings on painters. It's the same thing that what John Batista Noli did with the Noli map. It took him 14 years to measure that by hand and draw the Noli map of Rome. The same thing, he probably spent years and years researching and writing about all these painters. So just because it's not a book of architecture doesn't mean it, I mean, it needs to be included in this list. Because I'm getting off the subject, but you know, also Vasari has his own book on techniques. I've seen a lot of architecture students and people now when they go to the art store, they can of course buy anything because it's, you know, processed, but Vasari talks about how Michelangelo would actually make the blue ceiling in the Sistine Chapel. How is that done? He talks about the ultramarine blue, which ultra means beyond the sea, how they would get semi-precious stones, crush them and pulverize them. And of course, the ultramarine lapis lazuli is this really intense blue. So to get some of these colors, you know, Michelangelo and his assistants would crush and pulverize the semi-precious stones to make the pigment for the paint. You know, now we can go to Michael's or Dick Blick and just buy it online. But I mean, these people were serious about the craft and the proper formula to make their own paints. I was going to show you, if you're really interested in painting, then I was going to include this in the list of, I like to look at Salvador Dali. I know a lot of people don't like his work, but he was a phenomenal painter in the Renaissance technique of the Salvador. I'm sure you've seen him. He's a very popular. It's called his book on the 50. Now he's 50 secrets, not 10 or 4 like Claudio and Alberti. 50 secrets of magic craftsmanship. And you can buy this from Dover. This is such a wonderful, just a crazy, you know, acid trip of reading. He talks about Vermeer. He actually categorizes all the famous Renaissance, like Vermeer, Raphael, Titian, and rates them. He always would put Raphael as the best painter. Vermeer and Raphael. And of course, Raphael was a wonderful architect, as the 2 best painters in the entire world, over Michelangelo. You'll have to read it. But it's interesting because if you really want to study oil painting, Salvador Dali, like the American Vignola, kind of took some of the Italian Renaissance painters and made it a little bit simpler in their time. You have to read Dali's sort of narcissistic, bizarre ways he would paint by leaving his windows open and having these bees come in his apartment. He would start making honey and use the honey as the nectar between the pigments. It's a very bizarre read, but it's really wonderful. It's almost kind of like the bizarre read you get when you read Complexity and Contradiction. You read this and think, what are they talking about? But you know, I like to kind of throw little zingers in here because I think if I just showed you nothing but classical origin, you probably would get a little bit bored of it. But so Vasari and Dali are really wonderful theoreticians and writers. So are there any other last minute questions? We have about, I think, 5 more minutes.
Nothing new has popped up for questions as of, but
Yeah, I hope everyone's listening because, you know, usually when I do an online class in my studio, I can hear the cell phones going off or not paying attention, listening. But I like teaching this group because these people, you're serious about knowledge and want the information. So it's nice to have kind of different course. You know, what I was saying is I teach modern architecture in the afternoons at UTA for credits for their undergraduate program. So this class is very different. I like to go from modern to classical. And I always tell my modern students that they always have to reference the classical Renaissance world because both the ancient and modern world, I think, are still very relative.
great. Well, I think everyone is all set, and
Okay.
I'll let you though decide, you know, if you have any final words, of course.
No, I think this is it. I think I've given out enough information to kind of digest. Okay, well, I will see everyone next Tuesday for the next lecture. And so then in the summer, starting in June, I'll be doing drawing seminars for about 2 hours.
Great.
Thanks again, everyone. I'll see you next Tuesday.
Thanks, Trey.
Goodbye.